Let's cross now to London and catch up with Alexander Downer, who was Foreign Minister at the time of the bombings. I was working for him then. And Alexander, it's so raw still to think about it, isn't it, this atrocity after 20 years, and especially when you consider what's been lost to those 202 victims, including 88 Aussies.
Yes, I mean, first of all, you think of those who were so tragically and brutally killed in those circumstances, the permanent loss for the families, young lives, and they were almost all young people, brought to a sudden and premature end. So it was a ghastly event. On the other hand, out of tragedy, sometimes some good emerges. And what emerged from it was a very rapid rebuilding, really, of our relationship with Indonesia, which had fallen apart a bit over the issue of East Timor in 1999. And when I went up there, don't remember whether you were with me or not, but when I went up there to Bali and then subsequently to Jakarta, I received such a warm welcome from Indonesian officials, and the degree of collaboration between Australia and Indonesia was extraordinary, because we needed to get people in, first of all, to help the injured, try to evacuate some of the more seriously injured, and we needed to build collaboration in trying to find out who perpetrated this vile terrorist act. So the relationship with Indonesia really leapt forward as a result of that.
Yeah, look, I remember that visit, and I was there with you. We're seeing some vision of it now. I just want to go into that in a bit more depth, of course, because you met with the President, Megawati Sukarnoputri. You also met with, as I recall it, Bambang Yudhoyono was then effectively the Home Affairs Minister, and he was a crucial minister then. Of course, he later became President. And this level of intelligence engagement and policing engagement was not just crucial, of course, to get the perpetrators of the Bali bombing, but to try and snuff out Jemaah Islamiyah right across Indonesia in subsequent years.
Which they very substantially did do. There was another Bali bombing a couple of years later, not nearly as devastating as the one on the 12th of October 2002. But it wasn't that this brought to an end terrorist attacks, but it was the beginning of the end, at least for a long period of time. But you're quite right. I mean, I went up there with this team of people to try to build collaboration. I mean, a lot of it was to do with, as I mentioned earlier, the recovery of people, the identification of bodies, all sorts of gruesome tasks like that, which we had to help the Indonesians with, because there were so many victims. They simply didn't have the capacity in Bali to deal with that large number of victims. But the other side of it was to try to find out who did this, and to try to track them down. And we had the experience and the technology to do that, which frankly the Indonesians at that time lacked. So in particular, the Australian Federal Police, I think Nick Kelty must have been the commissioner at that time. Yep. Even our intelligence agencies like ASIS were summoned to work with the Indonesian intelligence services try to track down. Yeah.
So that was all very important, very clinical, high-end diplomacy, and we've talked about the repercussions of that. But I just want to mention something personal I saw on that trip in Bali. When they gathered away from the media, there was a forum for all the Australian survivors to come together, desperate for information. Where were their loved ones? Could they try and identify bodies? Could they track down their missing children? It was horrific. And I saw you in there just hugging Australians. They just wanted to hug another Australian. How did you hold yourself together through that situation?
You want to keep away from the media in those situations, because it's very, very personal. It was very emotional and very moving. But I used to think in those situations where it was, to say the least, tear-jerking, hugging the families of the victims, I used to think to myself, this is not about me. This is about them. And there's no place for me getting emotional. That's not going to help them. That is just about me getting emotional. So I used to think as best I could, look, no, let's be honest, in a very modest way, I used to think as best I could about them. Yeah, I remember it was in a hotel at Kuta.
It was indeed. It was indeed. Shocking, shocking memories. But thanks for sharing them with us, Alexander. I really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure.
Alexander Downer there, yes. Bali 2002. What a hellish event it was. But as Alexander said, and Julian Burton said, John Howard said, Ian Kemish said over the past 2 days, some good came from that horrible tragedy, that horrible atrocity.